Hi, everybody. So I see we're at the top of the hour. It's 12 o'clock. I'm going to start us off for Woodland Wildlife Wednesdays. Hello and welcome to Woodland Wildlife Wednesdays. Today's webinar is Ecology and Management of Wood Duck. So it's going to be exciting. And next month is our Ghost Forests of Maryland's Eastern Shore. Don't worry, this is still PG. You're not going to get scared. They're not real ghosts. It's going to be fine. We're talking about, you can see in that picture, we're going to talk about the loss of forests, specifically on the Eastern Shore with Matt Whitbeck. You know, have you been to Blackwater National Refuge? Have you been there? This is where that picture was taken. So next month, join us for Ghost Forests of Maryland, Eastern Shore with Matt Whitbeck. It's going to be a good one. He's a great speaker. It's a beautiful spot. If you like bike riding, if you like driving your car in scenic areas, it's great. It's great for the whole family, that Blackwater. So as a reminder, the webinar is being recorded. And the recording will be available at that website there, umd.edu/Woodland. I am your host today. My name is Agnes Kedmanetz. I work for University of Maryland Extension. I'm the Woodland Stewardship Educator. I contribute to the Maryland Woodland Stewardship Education Program, and I coordinate the Maryland Delaware Master Logger Program. We've been hosting the Woodland Wildlife Wednesdays since 2020. And I say we because there's somebody in the background there letting you in. It's Taylor Robinson. She's our roadie. She's part of the forestry team here too at University of Maryland Extension. So we're glad that you can join us and that you can join us every month. Don't forget, if you have any woodland questions, you can reach out to me and ask any questions. I may not know all the answers, but I know a lot of people that do have answers. So that's a little bit about me. If you have questions, or comments during the presentation, great, you could put them in the chat. What we're gonna do today, as you may already know, is we're gonna have the presenters present, and then we're gonna have a Q&A session at the end. So we're gonna have a question and answer session at the end where I'll go in and check the chat and see what questions you've put in there. So please, you know, if you got some good, clean duck jokes, you know, I'm open to it. You could put those in the chat too. So benefits of registering, you get the free quarterly newsletter called Branching Out. That'll keep you up to date with some of the things that we're doing here at Woodland Extension. We have a few field sessions coming up in Eastern Maryland, Western Maryland, and Central Maryland that you might want to become aware of. Also, there's going to be this neat webinar. Those are field in real life. But there's a webinar series that my colleague Jonathan is doing about biosolids and how they can be used in growing stuff. So interesting. But you can find out more about that when you get your Branching Out newsletter, okay? If you want to opt out, you saw that email there. So today's webinar, Ecology and Management of Wood Duck. So our presenters will discuss wood duck ecology, the history of wood duck conservation efforts in North America, and modern wood duck conservation programs available to Maryland landowners. I don't know if I told you guys already that I do wood duck box monitoring at Pickering Creek Audubon. I'm really excited to hear more about the wood duck. So today's speaker, we have Jake McPherson. He began with Ducks Unlimited in 2021 as a conservation intern. Shortly thereafter, he transitioned to a regional biologist role covering Maryland, Delaware, and West Virginia. In 2020, Jake became Duck Unlimited's manager of conservation programs for the Chesapeake Bay. In these roles, his responsibilities have primarily been development, fundraising, administration, and delivery of Ducks Unlimited's conservation program in the Mid-Atlantic region. He has delivered nearly 70 habitat conservation projects in the region, including over 6,000 acres of restored or enhanced wetlands and over 2,000 acres of land protection. These projects include working with conservation partners and private landowners to conserve an array of wetland habitats, including coastal and inland wetland ecosystems. Jake holds a Bachelor of Science in Wildlife Science from Virginia Tech and a Master's of Science of Woodland Wildlife Ecology from the University of Delaware. His work previously in he worked previously in several capacities researching wildlife ecology along the Atlantic coast with an emphasis on wildlife conservation. And his colleague with the Ducks Unlimited Farm Bill Biologist is Chase, and he began with Ducks Unlimited in 2019 as the Delmarva Farm Bill Biologist. His role is to provide outreach and technical assistance throughout Maryland, Delaware, and the Eastern Shore of Virginia for NRCS and USDA wetland programs under the Working Lands for Wildlife Black Duck program. Throughout this work, Chase has performed a variety of outreach methods to find new landowners, as well as assisting NRCS staff with designing and planning wetland restoration projects. Since 2019, Chase has communicated with over 50 landowners on potential projects with NRCS and continues to work towards implementing and completing wetland restoration projects throughout Delmarva. Chase holds a Bachelor of Science in Natural Resource Management from the University of Delaware and a Master's of Science in Wildlife Ecology from the University of Delaware. Prior to working for Ducks Unlimited, he worked as a soil conservation technician and assisted with multiple research opportunities related to waterfowl and upland game birds. You guys, these are the guys we want to hear from, right? These are the guys we want to hear from. So I'm glad they could join us today. So we found out a little bit about them. Let's find out a little bit about you. Where are you guys from? I am on the Eastern Shore here. I'm in Talbot County, but my office is in Queen Anne's County out of the Y Research and Education Center. So I'm coming from home, not from the Pawpaw Orchard. I'm coming from home on the Eastern Shore. So look at this. We got a mix of people here, you guys. This is nice. Central Maryland. We got some people from outside of Maryland. Welcome. Eastern Maryland. Oh, you guys, that's great. Thanks for letting us know where you guys came from. Thank you. Hopefully the weather is as beautiful as it is here. It's a little humid on the shore, but I hope it's as beautiful for you there where you're at. All right. So without further ado, why don't I stop sharing my screen? And Jake, if you want to start to share your screen, you're welcome to do so.
Good afternoon. So thank you, Agnes, for the introduction. Thank you for having me. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Again, I'm Jake McPherson. I'm Manager of Conservation Programs with Ducks Unlimited, located here in our Easton, Maryland office. And I'm here today, as Agnes mentioned, to talk to you about wood ducks in the context of Woodland Wildlife Wednesdays. But before I jump into that, I do want to give a quick overview on Ducks Unlimited so I can familiarize you all with what it is that we do and hopefully address some common misconceptions about Ducks Unlimited that I hear sometimes. So Ducks Unlimited is a nonprofit conservation organization focusing specifically on the conservation of wetlands and waterfowl populations. Obviously, most waterfowl are migratory and they traverse vast and broad geographies during that process each year. So they rely on huge landscapes. And to address that fact, Ducks Unlimited works continentally in North America. We have Ducks Unlimited Canada, Ducks Unlimited Inc. here in the United States, and Ducks Unlimited Mexico, or DUMAC, where we deliver conservation programs across all three of those countries. We're supported by a huge network of members and volunteers who support our mission by investing time and resources, which we leverage with funding, public funding sources and other funding to implement on-the-ground habitat conservation across the entire continent. So many of you may have heard of Ducks Unlimited and know that we are largely supported by waterfowl hunters. As a matter of fact, many of our staff, including myself, are waterfowl hunters, and we were actually founded way back in 1937 by a group of duck hunters who, at the time, had concerns about the status of waterfowl populations And that continues to be the case. We're supported largely by waterfowl hunters, but I do want to point out that we have a large contingent of non-hunting members who support our mission on the basis of the fact that the benefits of our work go well beyond waterfowl. Obviously, the work that we do benefits all types of wildlife, and it also benefits people in general by providing clean water, coastal resiliency, et cetera, et cetera. So a few of the misconceptions that I sometimes hear about Ducks Unlimited that I'll just kind of address now is, particularly for people who aren't intimately familiar with the organization, we are not a hunter advocacy group. We do recognize and value the support and benefits that hunters bring to conservation, but we do not advocate for or lobby for or against hunting legislation or firearms legislations or anything like that. And number two, the more common misconception is that we are not a clothing company. A lot of people see our logo on t-shirts and so on and so forth and think that we produce clothes. We do license our logo to clothing retailers as a source of revenue for our conservation mission. But we are all about putting wetlands on the ground and preserving existing wetlands. So real quickly, just an overview of some of the work that we've done since we were founded in 1937. On the left here is a map of North America, and each of those red dots represents a single DU project. As of 2020, we have about 737,000 members across the country. In the US alone, we've invested $5.4 billion towards conservation, and we've conserved continentally over 15 million acres as of last year. And then shifting over to the right here is a sort of heat map of Maryland that shows where our primary focuses are in terms of conservation delivery. We have worked in every single Maryland county. As of this year, we have just shy of 15,000 members in Maryland. We've invested $15 million in the state, conserving 54,000 acres. So with that sort of background of who we are, I will jump into the topic at hand, which, as was mentioned, is the wood duck. So you can see here examples of the Drake wood duck on the right and the hen or female wood duck on the left. The Latin name for wood ducks is Ix sponsa, and I kind of broke down what that translates to in English. Ix being water bird and sponsa being bridal dress. The bridal dress is in reference to the very ornate plumage of the male wood duck, actually. And because of that, wood ducks are one of the most easily recognizable waterfowl species in North America. That being, it being particularly beautiful, being one reason for its easily being identifiable. There are other reasons that I'll talk about as I move through this presentation, but it is one of 43 species of waterfowl that breeds in North America. But interestingly, it is the only North American species of the genus Ix. And in fact, it is one of only two species under that genus worldwide, the other one being the mandarin duck of Asia, which looks eerily similar to the wood duck. In fact, the females, you almost cannot tell them apart, but the males are more orange in color. So just a fun fact there. The other reason that many people know of the wood duck is that it has, relative to other migratory waterfowl species, it has a very broad breeding distribution in the United States. And so many people, it's in many of these locations year round. And so people have become more familiar with it. So speaking of distribution, at a continental level, focusing on the maps on the left side of your screen here, you're seeing a breeding distribution in red on the top and a wintering distribution in blue on the bottom. So a couple things of note. First of all, their breeding distribution is pretty extensive, covering a huge amount of the contiguous United States. It's interesting that if you look at that map, it's clear that their breeding distribution range or breeding range clearly avoids landscapes that are unforested. So obviously that being a hint to some of the habitat preferences that we'll get into a little later here. But I also wanted to compare their breeding distribution to what I would consider to be a more traditional waterfowl species, because this will be important as we get into the discussion about some of the conservation history of this species, and some of the challenges in conserving this species. If you look on the right, this is the green-winged teal distribution in North America. And this is more representative of what I would consider to be a traditional distribution, and that you see the breeding population being predominantly at northern latitudes up in the northern United States and Canada. And then this shift in migration of birds during the wintering season into southern latitudes in the United States and extending down into Mexico. You can see that's quite different than what's going on with wood ducks. And so interestingly, about half of the wood duck population in the United States is migratory. Those birds that are breeding in northern United States and southern Canada do pick up in the wintertime and migrate south to more southerly latitudes. However, the breeding population in southern states are actually non-migratory. So they stay in those areas all year round. And that is another contributing factor to why so many people can recognize wood ducks. It's one of the few species that we see stick around in this area through the summer. And actually, stemming from that, the wood duck was one of the very first waterfowl species described in European accounts during European colonization of North America. And it was referred to as the summer duck because of the fact that it was one of the only duck species that they saw here during the summer. So let's see. All right, so moving on. So what are their habitat preferences? Generally, when we're talking about habitat for wildlife, we lump species into kind of two different categories, one being specialists that rely on a very specific habitat type for survival, and one being generalists that can kind of utilize a broad array of different habitats. Wood ducks are interesting because, you know, I would almost call them, for what sense this makes, generalized specialists. And the reason that I say that is because they do have a higher affinity, more so than any other waterfowl species, for forested wetlands. And as we'll talk a little bit more, especially as it relates to breeding ecology. However, it is not uncommon to see wood ducks utilizing or present in almost all types of freshwater wetlands. So, you know, the habitats that you think of when you think of wood ducks are represented in these pictures. You know, the bottom right would be sort of a bottomland hardwood floodplain, you know, maybe swamp white oak and things of that nature. And the top right is a cypress swamp, the top left being a beaver pond there. And then the bottom left is kind of more of a non-traditional habitat, but obviously you can see them here in this picture in an emergent wetland. So just kind of to say that they do have an affinity for forested wetlands, hence the name wood duck, but it's not uncommon to see them utilizing many different types of wetland habitats. The one or two exceptions to that would be that generally they avoid saline habitats. So you're not going to find wood ducks in a salt marsh, for instance, generally. They also avoid vast open water wetlands, things like you know, large river reservoirs and things like that. But you would find them in you know, impoundments, even flooded crop fields, rivers, streams, etc. As far as feeding ecology, more so than most ducks, wood ducks are predominantly vegetarian in nature. One of the most common things that they forage on, especially during the winter, is acorns, hence their kind of affinity for forested wetlands and bottomland hardwoods. But they also forage on many different other types of vegetation, including, you know, other hardwood mast, various seeds, etc. And then one thing of note is that the hens in particular, as they move from the wintering season into the spring or the breeding season, they actually have a marked shift in their diet from vegetation related material to invertebrates. And they're seeking out the high protein, high calcium food sources in preparation for egg production and breeding season. So generally speaking, these birds are eating plant materials, with the exception of, in advance of the breeding season, they do shift a little bit to more animal matter and protein rich foods. So next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the breeding ecology, because this is, as Agnes mentioned several times in her introduction, a lot of people associate wood ducks with wood duck boxes and monitoring, et cetera. But this is another one of the primary reasons for the name wood duck and their association with forested wetlands is that they are a cavity nester, which is, I think there's about 5 or 6 species of cavity nesting ducks in North America, but wood ducks are known for this because they are, at least as it relates to people, they readily utilize artificial nesting structures, these wood duck boxes. But under natural conditions, you would see them utilizing natural cavities, typically, despite what most people would think, typically in living trees. A lot of times you go out and you see snags, and a snag being defined as a standing dead tree. And you'll see holes in them that have been created by woodpeckers, and you think, oh, this would be an ideal wood duck spot. Well, ironically, they actually select against those breeding sites because of the fact that, those trees are susceptible to falling down. They're not there to be, those sites aren't there to be used year after year after year. So more typically you would see birds utilizing cavities in living trees that were created by typically limbs falling off. And there's some examples here in my pictures on the right. You can see on the bottom right there, a hen sticking her head out of a natural cavity, and then the top right is kind of an artist rendering of a natural limb scar cavity. And then of course, a couple pictures and a duckling jumping out of a artificial wood duck box. But before I talk about boxes, I just kind of give some fun facts about the breeding ecology of wood ducks. So wood ducks are annually monogamous, meaning that once they form a pair, a male-female pair in a given year, those two are together for that year. And these pairs usually form, they can form starting as early as November and December, but typically almost all hens are paired up by February or March of that winter, sort of entering into spring. And the hen will select a nesting site as early, in southern latitudes, there's actually it's been documented that wood ducks will breed as early as January. Here in Maryland, more traditionally would be March, early April, you'll see nest initiation. And the male will stick with the female right up until the time that the eggs hatch. And then he bails and leaves the female to raise the ducklings. So once she selects a site, she'll begin laying eggs, and they lay 1 egg per day. And a typical clutch size is 10 to 12 eggs. And she won't actually begin incubating those eggs until the full clutch has been laid. One thing to note is that wood ducks are notorious, what we call dump nesters, or the more scientific term will be nest parasites. So when a hen is laying eggs in her nest that she's selected, another hen will often come in and dump eggs in there and then bail and expect this hen to raise her ducklings. And so as a result of that, it's not uncommon to find clutches in excess sometimes of 20 eggs. Of course, when there's that many eggs in a nest, many of them will not be successful, but that is something that if you're monitoring wood duck boxes, you see that frequently. The incubation period is 28 to 30 days. So at the time that she lays her last egg and starts sitting on the clutch, it'll be pretty exactly, if you estimate 29 days, you'll be within 1 day of actually seeing the ducklings coming out of the nest box. So it's a fun thing. If you're monitoring duck boxes, you can kind of time it pretty closely to get pictures of, that's how you get these pictures that I'm showing here of a duckling actually jumping out. But the ducklings, when they hatch, are precocial, meaning that they're pretty much equipped to live in this world, and they leave the box within 24 hours of hatching. And they do stick with the mother for quite some time in brood rearing habitats. And it takes them about 7 to 9 weeks to reach maturity. And then one other thing I want to note about wood ducks, it's kind of interesting as compared to other species of ducks. It's not uncommon for a wood duck hen to produce 2 clutches in a single year. And although it's not uncommon in wood ducks, it is rare in other duck species. So, if you have a wood duck hen that produces a clutch early in the spring and successfully raises it or loses it, she can initiate a second nest, which is obviously a valuable thing from population recruitment standpoint. So let's talk more about wood duck boxes, because again, you know, a lot of people are familiar with this, and if you have access to a wetland on your own property and wanted to pursue this, it's something that you could easily do. I will mention that in the grand scheme of things, although wood ducks readily use artificial wood duck boxes, research suggests that wood duck boxes produce a very, very small amount of adult birds in the grand scheme of things. So I guess the way to say that would be ducklings hatching out of wood duck boxes and surviving to adulthood comprises a very small percentage of the total wood duck population. So the vast majority of wood ducks are actually utilizing natural cavities. This is interesting because, as the case with Maryland, if you put a wood duck box near a wetland, it's almost guaranteed that a bird's going to show up and use it. So that can kind of give you some perception of how many wood ducks are actually out there. But despite not being particularly valuable at a broad scale, wood duck boxes can be valuable locally, particularly in cases where you have a landscape where natural cavities don't exist, where you don't have mature hardwood forests that these ducks can rely on. And there have been instances where wood duck box programs have been documented as being basically the sole reason that wood ducks exist in that given landscape. Here in Maryland, that's not the case because we do have natural habitat for them. But even that being the case, we do encourage landowners to utilize wood duck boxes because it really offers a good opportunity to directly interact with nature. It's fun. It doesn't hurt the ducks. In fact, it does benefit them to some extent. And really, it's a great youth activity. We see a lot of like Boy Scouts and what we call green wing Ducks Unlimited's youth programs are referred to as green wing programs. We work with youth to do wood duck boxes. So some information on that: you can either buy commercially available wood duck boxes online, or you can build them yourself. I would just recommend that if you do pursue building them yourself, that you visit. There's probably a ton of different places you can get this information, but Ducks Unlimited's website does have it, ducks.org. You can get information shown here on the right about dimensions and all sorts of things that are important that actually have resulted from a lot of research that has led to the development of a wood duck box that essentially maximizes the success rate of these hens. You know, things like, if you cut the entrance hole to a certain diameter, it allows the wood ducks to enter, but may exclude some of the common wood duck predators, for instance, like raccoons, or you can also get information on what types of material to use in building the boxes. Wood ducks will select against, just as an example, they'll select against treated lumber, right? So someone might say, well, I'm going to use treated lumber so it lasts a long time. Well, the wood ducks don't really like that. And so we recommend using untreated lumber, and in particular, types of wood that exhibit natural rot resistant, things like cypress and Atlantic white cedar. But there's a ton of information out there, and I don't want to spend too much time on it for the purposes of this talk, because I have a lot to cover. But please do seek that out at ducks.org. There's a ton of information on building boxes, where to install them, where the most appropriate place is, and most importantly, what kind of annual maintenance is required. Because I do want to point out that you can't just stick a wood duck box on a wetland and then walk away from it and say, oh, I've done a good thing and my job here is done. They do require annual maintenance, and without that maintenance, they actually can result in nest failures. So just want to encourage anybody who pursues that to make sure they understand the long-term time commitments with it. And I do have just for reference, this will be shared with you all at some point. And my last slide here is a list of resources with a direct link to the information on wood duck boxes. So with that, I'm going to move on from the box discussion and move into sort of the history of wood ducks, and more specifically, the history of conservation of wood ducks. This slide doesn't really sort of chronologically fit in my presentation, but I found it to be so fascinating that I kind of wanted to put it in here. So for the same reasons we've talked about, early colonists here in North America ran into wood ducks first because they're here in the summer, and et cetera, et cetera. A lot of archaeological evidence suggests that Native Americans likewise had longstanding relationships with wood ducks, and it's kind of witnessed in some of these historical artifacts. I have some notes about some of these. So that top picture there is a Native American pipe with clearly a wood duck head on one side and an owl head on the other side that was found in Virginia and dated to about 100 AD. The bottom pottery there gives pretty clear examples of bowls that were developed in the form of drake wood ducks here. Those were both found in Illinois and were dated to AD 1200. And then on the right, this is obviously not a wood duck, but I still find it fascinating. And for a time, this actual decoy here was on display at the Ward Museum in Salisbury. I'm not sure if it's still there, but if it is, you can go see it in person. This is a canvasback decoy, Native American canvasback decoy that was found in a cave in Nevada and dated to 400 BC. So while this is not an example of a wood duck decoy, I expect that those may have existed back then based on some of the other artifacts to be found. So moving forward in time, the fact that wood ducks are kind of year-round residents in many of the localities here in the Mid-Atlantic and South Atlantic has contributed to the fact that wood ducks are almost without question one of the most studied waterfowl species in the world. And so there is a ton of data out there about wood ducks, and I would certainly encourage people. I have, like I said, a lot of resources at the end where you can find some of this information, but information began to sort of be amassed about this species pretty early on, or more so than even many of the other waterfowl species. And so I want to talk about the initial population decline of wood ducks upon European colonization in North America. So at about the turn of the 20th century, late 1800s, early 1900s, wood ducks were believed to be at the brink of extinction. So I want to take and do like a little side note here, because of the fact that wood ducks have such an affinity for forested wetlands, it makes them really difficult to count at a large scale, right, compared to other waterfowl species. So in modern waterfowl management, we survey duck populations typically from aircraft. And most ducks breed in open landscapes. So we can go fly over the prairies and count the number of mallards or the number of teal or whatever, and have a pretty solid estimate of what's going on with that population. That is not the case for wood ducks, because you obviously can't see wood ducks from the air when they're in forested wetlands. So that's to say that even today, it's very difficult to get really accurate estimates of wood duck populations, which means that at the turn of the 20th century, there really was no estimates for what the population was. But what I can tell you is that there were many, many, many respected ecologists and ornithologists who, in their writings, believed that the wood duck was going to become extinct. And I think that was a reasonable assessment based on the fact that we lost many other species around that era too. Think like the passenger pigeon, the Carolina parakeet, et cetera, et cetera. Thankfully, or before I get to that, the reason of that decline was sort of this trifecta of effects here that I have pictures showing. The one on the left being, there's two gentlemen there in boats harvesting bottomland hardwood tree there, probably some sort of oak or something. But just an example of them harvesting trees in wood duck habitat, right? And at one point in time, nearly every single forest in the eastern, on the whole Atlantic seaboard was timbered, right? And so that was a big contributing factor. I actually have a picture here of more modern timber harvest. Timber still harvested in wetland areas. However, we have much better information these days and management strategies, and well, so I'll get into that. The second thing of the trifecta was that beavers were trapped to near extinction in many localities, particularly on the East Coast, right? And beavers, being the ecosystem engineers that they are, play a really important role in creating habitat, particularly for wood ducks in forested wetlands. And then number three, and perhaps one of the more impactful issues was that hunting at the time was rampant and out of control. And wood ducks were subject to even greater hunting pressures because they're present year round here, right? And so many of these duck species would show up in the United States, get hunted in the fall, and then they would depart and go back to Canada where there's very few people and weren't getting subjected to constant hunting. Well, wood ducks being here all the time were heavily harvested, right? And so those three things really led to the original downfall of the wood duck population. But I'm happy to be here talking to you today about how this is potentially the greatest North American conservation success story, because people did recognize that this was happening to wood ducks and other species about that time. And fortunate for wood ducks, it happened early enough that they weren't lost with the many other species that I mentioned earlier. And so while many things have happened between then and today that have led to the comeback of wood ducks, the most important of those was the passage of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in 1916. Prior to that, individual states made their own hunting seasons and bag limits, and they were hugely variable. Many times they kind of conflicted with one another. And in the case of wood ducks, most states allowed hunting of wood ducks straight through their breeding season, which is not a good thing, right? At the moment that the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was signed between Great Britain and the United States, really Canada, but at the time was Great Britain, it gave the federal government the authority to make decisions about hunting seasons and bag limits at a national level. It took it out of the hands of the states because this is now a federal issue because we have a treaty with another country dealing with this, right? And so this is actually a picture of the front cover of the original Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and highlighted in yellow here at the bottom. It specifically states that these species are nevertheless in danger of extermination through lack of adequate protection during the nesting season or while on their way to and from their breeding grounds, right? So this was like huge in terms of waterfowl, not just wood duck conservation, but waterfowl conservation. What came out of this, though, immediately in 1916 was a closure of the wood duck hunting season nationally. So without exception, wood ducks were not allowed to be hunted beginning in, I think it happened in 1918. And that would continue to be the case until about 1942, when the population had recovered sufficiently to allow a couple of states in the Mississippi Flyway to introduce a exploratory season and see how that went. And then it wouldn't be till 1958 that universally states would have hunting seasons for wood ducks again. So that's the big one, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. But there were many other things that have happened after that have contributed to the comeback, right? And I want to just run through a couple of those. Number one, at about that same time, the U.S. government started acknowledging that there was an importance to preserving large wetland complexes, and they started investing resources towards that, right? Not just the federal government, but state governments as well. But an example of that being that the first National Wildlife Refuge was acquired in Florida in 1903, and new refuges even today continue to be acquired for the purposes of providing important habitat for not only waterfowl, but wildlife in general. Also in that same era, nonprofit organizations focused specifically on wildlife conservation came about. One example of that being Ducks Unlimited, founded or established in 1937. Again, that's one example, but there are dozens and dozens of others that were formed around that same time, Audubon Society, et cetera. Also, logging practices have continually improved over time in sustainable forest management, things like that, which led to the reestablishment of mature forests in many of the landscapes where it had been lost. And obviously, it creates opportunities for wood ducks to move back into those geographies. Beaver populations have been, in some cases, reintroduced in certain geographies, but in others just naturally kind of recolonized areas that they had formerly occupied, creating more and more wood duck habitat. And then moving even further and further into the future, in the 1980s, federal and state wetland protections came about, right? So the federal government said, hey, wetlands are important for more than just wildlife. We really need to put some boundaries on what people can and can't do with wetlands. And today, many many wetlands are federally regulated, and those that aren't are oftentimes regulated at the state level. So, and then of course the development and pioneering of wood duck box programs, right? So even today in certain geographies that don't have natural cavities, there are people running wood duck box programs that are allowing wood duck populations to thrive in those areas. So lots of good things happened that fortunately for us resulted in the recovery of wood ducks, which leads us to my next slide, which is what is the current population status? So again, notwithstanding the fact that the wood ducks are difficult to count, as I mentioned earlier, the best data that we have suggests that the current continental breeding population is between 2.8 and 3.5 million ducks. I do want to point out that that's not a total number, right? Because it doesn't account for the young of the year, right? That's the number of ducks that are breeding. And then they have a hatch that spring. And in many cases, each pair might produce to adulthood one duckling. So you'd have half again as many than that, or somewhere in that neighborhood. So those same experts that kind of count wood duck populations estimated that between 1959 and 1990, the population experienced 10% growth per year continentally, which is just huge for a wildlife population. And it continues to be the case even now that they estimate usually around 1% growth each year. And interestingly, even today, the wood duck population is continuing to expand into sort of novel landscapes due to these wood duck box management programs, thinking specifically of areas like the Great Plains that don't have mature hardwood forests, or even I know that there are some wood duck populations in Nevada, which wouldn't strike you as a traditional landscape to support wood ducks. So currently, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service classifies the population as stable or increasing. And then sort of a side note here, wood ducks are currently the #2 most commonly harvested duck in the United States, behind only the mallard, which is, I'm sure everyone here knows of the infamous mallard. And that's been the case, though, for 25 of the last 30 years. Wood ducks make up, I think, about 10% of the total waterfowl harvest in North America each year. So, and then my last slide here, I'm kind of running over on time, so I'm going to keep this short. We'll make sure Chase has plenty of time for his presentation. Where do we go from here, right? Modern habitat conservation and population management, what is it, and how does it ensure sustainable wood duck populations? So, it requires two things. One, be on the conservation side, right? And that's what Ducks Unlimited focuses on. This graph, obviously not really a scientific graph, but kind of showing our acre deliveries over the last 85 years. This is what we focus on, but this is just an example from Ducks Unlimited. There are dozens of other nonprofit organizations that are doing wetland habitat conservation that would benefit wood ducks. Almost every, without fail, every state agency and the federal government has programs that focus on habitat conservation. So that is the first sort of key to the puzzle of sustainable wood duck populations and sustainable waterfowl populations in general. The other key being adaptive harvest management, which is on the hunting side. Basically, adaptive harvest management, I could spend a whole day speaking to you about that. But in a nutshell, it is how the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the state wildlife agencies and the Canadian Wildlife Service approach setting harvest limits and season lengths for hunting in North America. And basically, it relies on the continuous collection of data so that will advise on the status of these populations annually, right? And so in a very generalized sense, it's, they do population surveys for most all species every year. And if, that survey suggests that the population is doing quite well, then they may recommend a liberal hunting season length and a more liberal daily bag limit. But if they do a survey and it shows that the population has, undergone some struggles or for whatever reason hasn't been doing as well, then they may recommend either a conservative hunting season, conservative bag limits, or in the most restrictive scenario, a closed season. And, again, what we saw in the early days of conservation. So, and I'll just mention too that the goals for waterfowl populations are actually set by the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, which is which is publicly accessible online. You can go check that out if you'd like to see. So that is the conclusion of my presentation. I do have all these resources here, but again, this will be shared with you all at a later time. And I don't want to take away from the time of my colleague Chase, so I'm going to turn it right over to you so you can talk about conservation opportunities for landowners.
All right, thanks, Jake. A little bit of brief background, kind of going into my slides here. So, in case you missed, I'm basically the Farm Bill biologist for Dutz Unlimited throughout the Delmarva Peninsula. My name is Chase Colmorgen. I work with Dutz Unlimited, but I also am partnered working with NRCS and the USDA. For those of you who might not know, NRCS is the Natural Resources Conservation Service. They're like a sub-agency of the USDA with the goals of soil and water conservation and agricultural best management practices to improve soil and water quality. So to give you some background as far as how my partnership came about and how this has been built up, we as an organization recognize the significant impact that NRCS offers throughout the country for wetland and grassland projects. And a lot of times with the work that we do, specifically in Maryland and the Eastern Shore of Maryland, we have specific grants that we work in, and they can sometimes limit us by specific counties or the amount of projects or funding, et cetera. So recognizing that NRCS is a nationwide entity that can work across any county, has more flexibility with projects and being able to work with more landowners, kind of brought about this partnership to really increase the awareness of wetlands and waterfowl programs that are available through NRCS, as well as, it aligns directly with our mission of increasing habitat and conserving wetlands and waterfowl for the future. So some of the USDA programs that I'm going to touch briefly on today is the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP, Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, or CREP, and then lastly is the Wetland Reserve Easement Program. So it's important to note before I kind of get into these that I kind of want to touch on the least restrictive moving up to the more restrictive programs and how they kind of function and how we utilize them and what type of restoration opportunities are available through them. So the first being EQIP is the least restrictive program, I would say. It's what we call a practice payment program. Basically, what you're working with here is a cost share program that strives for 75% coverage of work. We take specific practices and then we use each practice to build it into an actual project for you, typically on the shallow water area side of things. So your freshwater emergent wetland impoundment would be typically what we do a lot of on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, as well as throughout Delmarva. A lot of these have benefits for wood ducks, as most of them tend to be near bordering wood lines or close to it. And so we can kind of utilize the open water habitat that Jake kind of mentioned that they will use, not vast open water, obviously, but just some of these smaller flooded, basically like a flooded crop field is what these turn into. And you have, different varieties of vegetation available and food sources for wood duck, as well as many other waterfowl. So through EQIP, these payments can vary by state and they're based on a per unit basis. I'm going to touch on some of these practices in my next slide, but to give you some examples, for these, we typically would have a berm that we would, be basically placing somewhere in a field that would allow us to back up and impound the water that we want for a shallow water area. So you might get paid, based off of a linear foot of the berm or the cubic yardage of it. Or if you, want to manage the water levels of it, you would be paid per unit cost for a water control structure. So each one of these things we would basically combine together to create a wetland or restore a wetland to its former habitat. So these projects, the funding is determined through a ranking process, depending on the size of the site, the environmental impact, if you're doing other management activities on your property that are improving waterfowl or other wildlife. These are all taken into consideration, and those that rank highest are the ones that will get funding for that year. Just because you might not get funding for 1 year doesn't mean you won't ever get it. It just means you might have to wait another year. But typically, since I've been here for 2.5 years, we have not turned any projects away. We've been continuing to take every new project that we get in. And lastly, to mention with EQIP is you have roughly a 15-year maintenance life on it, meaning that you're just expected to maintain it to NRCS's management plan, mainly just to limit invasive species, not allow trees to grow up on the edge of the berm, because that can actually end up creating some failures with the water being able to stay impounded inside of that bermed area. But otherwise, it's very unrestrictive. So as I mentioned, some of these practices I just want to touch on really quickly about what we use EQIP for. If you have any interest in doing, more open emergent wetlands, so we would use a shallow excavated pond practice or dike installation if it's just going to be a berm. Structures for water control, I'm going to touch on a little bit later as far as the importance for management for waterfowl areas for moist soil management. And one that I think is really important for this talk is structure for wildlife. So EQIP will actually help cost share the building of wood duck boxes if that is something that you have an interest in. And typically we would combine that in with, a larger project of if you're doing, a shallow excavated pond. Typically these areas aren't more than 18 inches, which is why we call them shallow excavated ponds. And they're more or less designed to be shallow enough for waterfowl usage. Most dabbling ducks would like between 8 to 10 inches of water, but you'd have the ability to put at least 18 inches of water on it on average if you would like. But going back to that, the structure for wildlife, you have the opportunity to get cost shared on building your wood duck boxes or purchasing them already completed and allowing them, to put them up on your property as you need them. The next two that I really want to touch on is wetland creation. This would be if you say have a farm field that is relatively marginal in a spot. However, we come out and identify the soils as non-hydric, or meaning it was not historically a wetland. We would be able to use wetland creation to actually create a wetland there, even though historically it didn't exist. And we can use NRCS's funding to do so. And then wetland restoration is kind of exactly how it sounds. This would be an area that we would go and check and say, oh yes, it does have the hydrology, or it has the hydrate soils, which is wetland, it does have historically wetland soils there. We can restore this to a form of wetland. Now, it is important to note, a lot of what we do is more on the style of early emergent wetlands and open water. However, using the wetland restoration practice through NRCS, you can actually use this to restore wetland to a forested wetland, which was most likely historically what's been there based off of what we see on the eastern shore. So if you had an interest in taking possible low-lying marginal cropland out of production, or even if you have a heavily wooded area that was ditched and the hydrology has been altered, you can actually use the wetland restoration code for EQIP, and we can cost share on restoring that to more natural functioning wetland as it used to be. Lastly, the one that I'd like to cover on this list is herbaceous weed control. This is one that's really important that we use a lot of on the eastern shore, actually throughout all of Delmarva, being that we can actually help cost share for Phragmites spraying. Especially the lower shore counties of Maryland. Those of you who are from the eastern shore might know this. Phragmites has just kind of blown up, and it's extremely hard to manage and get a hold of. So by using EQIP here, it's over a 3-year practice that we help cost share to help you kind of get control of the Phragmites and kind of get it back to where you can manage it more appropriately. The next program I want to talk about briefly is the Conservation Reserve Easement Program, or CREP. So CP9s is basically a shallow water area, which would go along with a shallow excavated pond, as I just talked about. So they're very similar in that you're basically utilizing a berm or similar areas to stop water in a low-lying area of a field, or basically create this early emergent habitat using an incoming watershed. The CP23 and 23A is very similar, again, to the wetland restoration that I just mentioned, in that we can also work in some wooded areas here. For the most part, we don't want these to be moist soil managed, which I'll talk about a little bit later, so that they're natural functioning wetlands. The water level is naturally rising and lowering as it would naturally. The more restrictive side of CREP is that you do have to have a cropping history of 4 out of the previous 6 years. You have to prove that you had cropped a field and it has an actual record of it on hand. Otherwise, you can't receive funding for the CREP program. Conversely, the benefit of going into this program versus EQIP is you get a higher cost share percentage. Typically, we're close to 100% cost share on these to put in and restore an area for you. And on top of that, we provide an annual rental payment through NRCS that you basically get paid a certain amount of money for your 15-year contract as you're enrolling the wetlands, into this program. So this is more of a benefit to farmers or those that have areas that are just not being super productive and they still want to make some annual money off of it. This would be a good program to look into for that. Lastly, and what I would call the most restrictive program is the Wetland Reserve Easement Program. Basically, this is exactly, well, the most strict. So it is a permanent or a 30-year easement. We're basically buying the real estate value of your property, and in return, you're getting paid a certain amount based off of the geographic area rate caps, which range every year from land appraisals surrounding you as well as actual real estate averages. So you would get paid a certain amount of money for the area that you want to take out of production, and you will then have also close to 100% coverage for the restoration costs for a permanent easement. Most tend to not do the 30-year easement because you get lower easement values and lower restoration costs. So a lot of people that we have enroll will typically go towards a permanent easement. The benefits of this program versus EQIP and CREP, and especially for wood duck habitat, is a lot of the sites that we have enroll are typically already forested wetland or were historically forested wetland. And the reason this program works well for that is a lot of these wooded areas that we see on the eastern shore of Maryland and throughout Delmarva, if they've stayed wooded, for as long as they have, typically that means that it was too wet to drain and even used for ag purposes back, 100 years ago or more when everything was getting really cleared out here. So there's already some additional protections usually in place where we wouldn't want to go in there and disturb a naturally functioning forest or wetland and create, an emergent shallow water area as I've talked about for the past two programs. But for the wetland reserve easement, the benefit here is we would be looking for these large tracts of forested lands or partially, open and crop, take everything in together. And we would look for areas where the hydrology has been altered. So was this area heavily ditched? Was there berms put up to move water from one spot to another because they were having flooding issues or something like that? And what we would look at there is, how can we basically restore everything to a naturally functioning forested wetland while also possibly creating new habitat on the fringe of the forest, maybe some shallow water areas outside of it. And so there is some variety here as far as what we can do with WRE and its benefits to waterfowl as well as other wildlife and amphibians out in the area. So I guess mainly what I'm getting at is WRE is the most permanent program out of all of them. However, it has its place and its benefit. If you have a large tract of land that you have an interest in doing, it's primarily wooded, this would be a great program for you. And we've also been starting to use it for salt inttruded areas along the eastern shore. So, areas that we're starting to see more salt intrusion or sea level rise issues, we're starting to try and implement through NRCS some new protocols to actually take this area out of production and enroll it into an easement so that it's actually protected, and we're basically restoring it in preparation for marsh migration inwards, which that is quite a lengthy topic, but just to touch on that, we do actually have some options for those of you that are on the eastern shore or experiencing possible sea level rise or marsh migration issues onto your crop fields or wooded areas. So I mentioned this briefly before, and I just want to touch on it real quick, is moist soil management and the importance when it comes to waterfowl, especially for a food source. So what is moist soil management? Basically, it's the manipulation of water levels through drawing down water and then reflooding it at different times of year. Basically, the length and time of year that you're doing your drawdowns can dictate the type of vegetation you have. So in this image here, your top left, you're kind of seeing basically a drained shallow water area as part of early management in spring. And then the longer the drawdown you have, instead of it being pulling all of the boards out of the water control structure at once, the longer the drawdown, the more variety of plants you get as the water level recedes. So you get a better variety of plant. So some examples here are some sedges, millet, and smartweed. So all these are very important for waterfowl, and they will also be utilized by wood ducks. So moist soil management benefits many species, but as well as wood ducks. And so the other thing there is that if you were to just pull all of your boards out at once, you might end up with more of a monoculture of plants where you don't get as big of a plant variety. The benefits here, and just real quick in this picture, you can kind of see these two boxes. This is what I'm referencing as a water control structure. Basically, it just has a few boards that allow water to back up to a certain height. And then as you're pulling those boards, it slowly, gradually lets water out. So the benefits here is that you can have up to 2,000 pounds of seed per acre. Again, it's much more of it is active management, but it's not as active as, say, some who would go in there and try and plant corn or other agricultural crops. It's less intrusive for the overall health of the wetland. And actually for Maryland and for our NRCS programs in Maryland, we don't allow you to plant any agricultural commodity crops in these wetland areas. We strictly want them to be moist soil managed or functioning naturally. The other benefit here is that it minimizes invasive or unwanted perennial plant growth, as well as can help with controlling a lot of different invasives, and you can really have more of a control over your plant matter there. And lastly, as Jake kind of touched on with wood ducks, how they kind of shift in their dietary needs, by using moist soil management, we can actually have a more diverse invertebrate and aquatic habitat, which is utilized heavily by waterfowl turning into early spring as they start migrating or preparing for breeding to build up on protein and calcium for egg production for their breeding seasons. So lastly, that I want to touch on here is just what we really look for when we're trying to do feasible sites for wetlands work. As you can see in these two pictures, this is basically a partially wooded but mostly open ag field that is just, for lack of a better purpose, completely inundated and not really beneficial to cropping anymore, because you can kind of see that the crops on it overall are just, they weren't even harvested because it was so wet that year, and how badly rutted it is out there. So this is more of an extreme example of what we look for, but this is a good kind of visual to kind of understand what we're looking for these when we're talking about our open areas. So what we look for is more or less gentle slopes. We don't really want very, very steep drop-offs or sharp changes in elevation. As previously mentioned, we want to have areas that we can berm and be more gradual and basically not create, like an 8-foot berm or something in a field. We tend to try and keep them relatively low, like no more than 2 or 3 feet. So we look for gentle elevation. On the Eastern Shore, it's pretty common. Western Shore, Maryland, probably out west even further, it's a little bit more difficult depending on where you are. The next thing we look at, as I just previously mentioned, is wet fields, damage to crops, marginal production. These are pretty indicative of either a hydrate soil, an inclusion of hydrate soil, or an area that just is not well drained and more suitable for wetlands work. Hydrate soils are preferred. So that's what I've kind of touched on before. A hydrate soil being one that is identified as historically being a soil indicative of a wetland. So we prefer to work in these because we know that as we restore an area into, whatever type of wetland we're working in, it's going to function naturally as a wetland. And it's going to have that natural vegetation and that seed bank within it, so that once we do the restoration and complete it, we're actually going to see it functioning as it should. Kind of tying into the gentle slopes part of it is the topography of the site relative to the existing elevation. We like to tie our berms into our existing elevation. So again, it's not a monstrosity of a huge berm in a field or something that is kind of an eyesore. We want to make them look as naturally as possible. So having that opportunity to have some elevation change is beneficial, so that we can actually use that to make it look like a natural wetland and have it function and look better. And lastly is an incoming watershed. Having that incoming watershed allows the wetland to fill up with water and basically filter that water and clean it before it goes back out. And so that's a big benefit for overall health of the surrounding area, especially bordering ag fields. And one I did skip over, I apologize, was drainage. How to get the water off. We typically try and build close to ditched areas or areas that have positive drainage away from it, so where we put our water control structure would be the lowest spot, so that we allow the water to go out of the impounded area when you're managing for more soil management, but then we can, it's not going to impede water downstream or have any issues, back cutting into the berm area itself, basically having positive flow away from it. So we would typically look for an area that's ditched or has positive drainage away from where we're working. So just some project examples to kind of bring all of what I just talked about together. Most of these are going to be early emergent wetlands, but I'll explain how some of them can also benefit for wood ducks as well. This first one is actually one of Jate's projects out on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And what you're looking at is kind of, again, pretty wet spot in the center of the field and kind of low with, as you can tell, some drainage issues here. So this is like a before, and then that would be the completed wetland. As you can see, a lot of the trees were left intact, which would be beneficial for wood ducks and as well as other waterfowl for nesting and other opportunities. And this one is kind of deceiving. This is actually on the Eastern Shore of Virginia, but this was more of an example of what happens when you don't properly manage for invasives and perennials in a wet area. And so, as you can see, it kind of grew up into more or less undesirable plant matter. And so we actually restored this to more of a early emergent wetland. Again, you'll see a common theme in a lot of these pictures. Most of the projects that we work on are very close or border a tree line or wood line. And from what I've seen in the past, just about every single one of our impoundments that we build or we work on and restore has some sort of wood duck usage on it. So we will get some variety of, even though it's not directly in the woods, we still get a good variety of usage from waterfowl. Here's another example again with a ditched ag field, and you're kind of seeing, again, a lot of drainage here, but this is what we would typically look for because we could also install, a structure here and basically plug this ditch and flood this whole area, thus restoring hydrology to it and also allowing that water to back up. So that would be an example of what it would look like afterwards once you accomplish something like that. Lastly, and this is probably one of my best sites, for example, for wood duck usage. This is, again, pretty common for what we get a lot of work in. It's borderline on wood edges. We do a shallow pond here, and we typically see 80% of the birds that are using it, depending on where it is are going to be wood ducks. And I actually had a video. I was unable to put it in for one of the sites just like this. And I mean, there were so many wood ducks in it that you couldn't even see the water because it was so heavily used by them. So this is a before and this is after. Prior to any rain, it was kind of a dry time of year. So afterwards, this did fill up and it got a lot of wood duck usage. For that, I think that's all I have. So any questions? I guess we can start answering some questions for you guys.
Great, you guys. That was a great presentation. Lots of information there. So I hope you all can stick around for the Q&A. I see some question and answers in the chat. I'm going to try and hold off on my questions. Usually I have a lot of questions, so we'll get through the questions presented. I noticed that your email address, everybody, Jake and Chase's email address is in the chat. So if you would like that, and I noticed that it's here on the screen. So let's jump on into these questions because we got several good ones. What are some of the other species in that AIX genus? How did you pronounce that, Jake? AIX.
Yeah, I can answer that. There's only one other species in that genus. It's pronounced Ix. And the only other species in it in the world is the mandarin duck. You can Google it. The hen looks identical to a hen wood duck, and the male looks very similar to a Drake wood duck, except it's orange. And interestingly, although it is native to Asia, there have been some escaped mandarin ducks in the United States from aviaries, and they have established breeding populations in certain areas. I know there's a small one in South Carolina and also one in the Pacific Northwest. So you actually can encounter them in the wild, but they're very rare here.
This person's asking, did I hear correctly that wood duck nests in wetlands? Did I hear correctly that wood ducks nest in wetlands without trees or other cavity?
So I did not say that. However, that has been documented. It's very rare. Wood ducks are predominantly will seek out cavities to nest. However, I know that there are a couple of examples in southern Canada of wood ducks nesting on top of muskrat huts in like marshy locations without a cavity. But again, that's exceedingly rare.
Okay. Can untreated wood duck boxes be painted and still be chosen by nesting wood ducks?
So I would say the answer to that would probably be yes. There are tons and tons of different types of wood duck boxes out there. You'll see plastic ones, you'll see metal ones, you'll see whatever. They will use all of those, but they will select against those, meaning that if there is a more suitable one that is, not treated, it's going to get more use, for instance, which is why we suggest using things like cedar and cypress wood, because it has natural rot resistance. But wood ducks will use just about anything that they can fit into. The question is it going to be beneficial to them, and is it as good as it could be? There's some documentation out there that, for instance, plastic and metal wood duck boxes, if a bird does a late season nest, they can overheat and it can actually, hurt the hens and things like that. So my recommendation would be to stick to something like cedar, and to be honest with you, if you didn't care how long the box was going to last, it's perfectly fine to use untreated pine. You just need to know that you're probably only going to get about 2 years out of it, with it weathering and rotting and things like that. But it is going to require that you go take it down when it's not serviceable anymore.
Okay. This is, can you go to a tree and drill a hole in it and do that? Will they do that?
No.
Can we just dig a hole out of a tree and?
No, because, I guess you could do it, but it would be exceedingly difficult because it's not just the hole. If you look inside a wood duck box, right, you have this small hole that they enter through, and then it opens up into a pretty big, substantial area that they require to nest. And again, the dimensions that would be on Ducks Unlimited's website for establishing those boxes, they're not just a shot in the dark. It's crazy how over-engineered wood duck boxes are. Almost every dimension that's provided is there for a reason. They found out that it's beneficial to have the hole so many inches from the bottom. And in that one picture that I shared, I can actually go to it. This one here, you'll see we're looking down at a hen, and you actually see a little bit of wire on the bottom of this picture that's stapled to the inside of the box. That's actually a ladder for the ducklings to climb up so they can reach the hole. There's a lot of different things that have been overstudied in regards to wood ducks, and I would recommend following the plans that are available online. So.
Okay, great. Were wood duck feathers used in fashion industry in the early 20th century?
I would say yes, that they were certainly part of the millinery trade, which was a huge thing that impacted way more than just ducks. But the fact that wood duck feathers happen to be particularly beautiful, I'm certain that there were people out there that wanted those feathers for their hats. And interestingly enough, the first national wildlife refuge that was ever established in Florida was actually in direct response to the millinery trade, where people had been going down to these wading bird colonies and decimating them for feathers. So that trade led to the development of the National Wildlife Refuge System, an example of which being locally Blackwater.
Wow. One door opens, another one closes. Interesting example on that. Yeah. Okay, so we have a little tidbit here from one of our, I know this person loves history, so it's nice that we're getting some local history. In the 19th and early 20th century, market gunning was a way of life here in Dorchester County. Hunters would pack their birds in barrels and ship them to the restaurants in Annapolis and Baltimore. Wow.
Yeah, I would recommend anybody on this call that's interested in that to pick up the book called The Outlaw Gunner, which focuses on the history of market hunting for waterfowl in the Chesapeake Bay region. Very good read, and it references a lot of local areas, so particularly lower shore of Maryland.
Outlaw hunter, is that what you said?
The Outlaw Gunner, I believe it's called.
Outlaw Gunner, you guys. Okay. All right, so we got two other messages coming in here. So is there less logging in wetlands due to the dependence on foreign lumber or some other reason? You had mentioned there's less. Look, I like
Yeah,
that
so
he's thinking about this here.
I can't specifically answer that question because I'm not informed on where the United States gets most of its lumber. But I can tell you that the science behind forest management has grown with all other wildlife and nature sciences leaps and bounds since the turn of the 20th century. And there's a lot of acknowledgement that these forests are important not just for products like lumber and paper, but for wildlife, right? And that is incorporated into to forest management and commercial harvesting and stuff like that. So while I don't know if it has, I'm certain that current logging rates on the East Coast are not as high as they were at certain points in the past, but there are protections in place that would preclude us from completely harvesting all of the forests that wood ducks would rely on at a given time, if that makes sense. So.
And in the chat, one of our Forest Service friends wrote that most of the wetlands in Maryland are in the critical areas. So there is definitely restricted logging in those critical areas. And so replanting involved in that too. So it's interesting to compare what logging was before, like how long ago are we comparing it to today? So it does.
And those critical area laws are important. However, they focus on tidal wetlands. So it's a buffer around tidal wetlands, right? And a large proportion of freshwater forested wetlands are disconnected from tidal wetlands. And because forestry is considered agriculture, it's exempt under a lot of federal and state wetland protection laws. So, you may see somebody logging an area that is in fact a wetland and they're not violating wetland laws. But yes, most wetlands in Maryland are in critical areas. That's correct.
So when you're logging in those wetlands, generally there's a restriction on how much they can even take out. And particularly, there's not really very many good machines that want to work in wetlands. So the decrease of logging and harvesting in these areas is due to the equipment and regulations. Maryland has great regulations that restrict harvesting in buffered areas, even whether it's a tidal wetland or not. If it's buffering a certain body of water, you have to maintain a certain density of trees within that. So those are contributing factors of why logging is not as intense as it was back in the day when we were making sailboats and stuff like that.
No doubt.
Okay. We got a question here from a Hartford Glen Park. So this person volunteers at Hartford Glen Park in Hartford County. They're interested in reviving their wood duck trail, which has fallen to disrepair. They lack staffing and materials to restore and maintain the boxes. Can you offer any suggestions to point us in the right direction?
Yeah, so unfortunately, so I think Chase has some comments on that, but first, so we also do not, as an organization, have the capacity to assist in long-term maintenance of boxes, right? An interesting side note, I actually maintain about 60 boxes on the shore myself, just as a volunteer. And I would certainly encourage Hartford County to engage local communities and inform them that that is a need. And a lot of people are interested in this stuff. And one other, a couple other avenues they can look to is local Boy Scout troops. There's always a Eagle Scout looking for a project, right? And so you just have to make sure you explain to them up front that there's, more than just a build it aspect. There's some, expectations of long-term management. And one thing that I neglected to mention in my presentation is there's an excellent organization in Maryland called the Maryland Wood Duck Initiative. It's linked on the resources page that I provided. A gentleman over there kind of maintains data on thousands of wood duck boxes in Maryland annually, and he puts out an annual report, kind of the state of wood ducks in Maryland. And he relies on landowners who manage their own boxes and emails them the results of the hatch, right? And so I would speak to him to see if he knows anybody in the Hartford County area that might be interested in taking on that responsibility, because he has a large network of people who are interested in that. He also sells at wholesale prices wood duck boxes, wood duck box building materials, and predator guards as well. So, and Chase, I know NRCS has some stuff too.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, as far as like the equip practice, we do, and this might actually answer one of the other questions. We do work with other levels, not just private landowners. We can work with, county entities, state entities. We work with other nonprofit organizations for projects. So if that's something that might possibly be an interest, we can, depending on the scale of the project, obviously we can look into doing and offering some assistance on that from NRCS's end. I would add to kind of off of what Jade said, as far as like the Boy Scout route or, having other volunteers. I know like your local 4-H chapter or that kind of avenue, there's always a lot of people who want to do wood duck box work as well. So that might be an option more locally to have, a volunteer event almost. And like Jade said, possibly getting the materials from someone else at cost, and then being able to have someone come in and help build them is really the big part of it. So
my add-on to that is contacting somebody like the Pickering Creek Audubon and find out how their program is going. I think they have 4 or 5 volunteers to do the wood duck box monitoring. And there's the Maryland watershed, master watershed folks out there. There's Maryland master naturalists that want to contribute to their community. So reaching out to some of them to maybe help. So I hope that helps you get some ideas of what to do. Maintenance is so important. Okay, Chase, this one sounds like it's for you. Who qualifies for EQIP? Is it only private landowners, or do local county landowners also qualify? I think you kind of touched on that just in your last statement.
yeah, so we are kind of more flexible with EQIP. So it can be a private landowner, or it can be an LLC, a group of people. It can be any sort of entity. We have done some work with other nonprofit organizations as well, like in Delaware. We work with Delaware Wildlands, if you're familiar with them, and so it's kind of available to just about anyone, honestly. So as long as they qualify for the minimum requirements that NRCS has, such as like we have a income limitation for that, and that's really the only limitation that you have when you're signing up for that program. So
Chase, I'm wondering if they're asking if the county owns it, is it eligible? Because do you know, like if the state owned a piece of property, or if the actual municipality owned it, they may not be eligible. But if it's a private entity,
yeah,
is that
so
right?
I think that's that. I don't know. I haven't actually done any with a county or state entity directly. So typically in Maryland specifically, we have Maryland Department of Ag does their own sector of their restoration work as well, and offer cost share for that. So I don't know if that would be something that would be more geared towards that sort of program than working through NRCS. But that is something that I can certainly look into. If the person wants to follow up with me, I can look into it for them. So
Great. Thanks for that, Chase. So y'all, you can follow up with Chase if you have questions about private or public lands. So we got a compliment there. This was a very valuable session. Thank you. And there's your emails again, folks. Another question here. Is there any data on whether or not monitoring nest boxes causes female ducks to abandon their nests? Oh my gosh, Nancy. I wondered that too when I'm out there. Good question.
So the short answer is yes, there is data out there. The long answer is, when we say monitor, when I say monitor boxes, what I mean is that once a year you need to go and change the wood chips out, right? And we usually recommend that people do it like this time of year, as a matter of fact. And at the time of doing that, you can actually pull out and find what we call membranes. It's like a liner on the interior of the shells, and you can count how many birds hatched out of that box, right? And so you would count how many hatched, report that to, if you're working with Maryland Wood Duck Initiative, then you would replace the wood chips, close it up, and you're done with it until this time next year. So there would be no interacting with the ducks necessarily during their actual breeding season. We actually try to recommend that people don't do that, because these birds are still migratory birds, and it is in fact against the law to just go out and catch one or harass it or anything like that, unless you're operating within the confines of allowable hunting opportunity and seasons. However, if you were watching, if you had a wood duck box in your backyard and you could see it frequently enough that a hen was going in and out, you could time the hatch and get pictures of the ducklings and everything. the data in regards to what you're asking about is that wood ducks are very resilient against disturbance, particularly if they get to the phase of incubation. Essentially, what you have to compare it is, this duck has just invested every ounce of energy that it has to do the thing that it was born to do, which is procreate, essentially. And that they do not want to give up on that, right? So it's possible that if you disturb them very early on, they may move to another site. But if they get invested and are incubating, they typically will stick it out. And I know this because in one of my former jobs, my job was to catch wood ducks and monitor their nesting. And we were actually looking at sort of a sidebar, whether incubation temperature affects phenotype. So like you always hear about if you incubate an alligator egg at a certain temperature, you get all males. Well, birds and reptiles are closely related. And so we were studying whether there's similar interactions with incubation and wood ducks. And I would be checking those boxes on a daily basis and almost never had hens completely abandon the boxes. So that was the long answer to that.
Jake, you brought up something really interesting there, that wood duck box monitoring really could only take place once a year, and it sounds like maintenance happens maybe twice. Once to take out and count the membranes and take out the wood chips, and then the second time to go in to put the wood chips in. Is that what I'm hearing?
So I typically do it all with one visit. I go to my boxes one time a year, usually in September or October. I'll pull out all the old chips and count the membranes, and then put the new chips in at that same time, and it will sit there through winter and be ready for a wood duck in the spring. And also, it's worth mentioning, I did not mention this, but tons of other things also use wood duck boxes. Sometimes it's disheartening if you really want wood ducks, because you end up with owls and cardinals and all sorts of weird stuff. But yeah, so it's, it benefits more than just wood ducks, certainly.
Yeah. Great. I put the Wood Duck Box Initiative website in the link if anybody wants to find out more of that. Thank you all for putting the outlaw gunner information on there. There's the link to the website. Thank you for the informative session. Okay, so I see that it's 1:28, you guys. I'd like to wrap up in a couple of minutes, but these questions are so good and important, so I don't want us to necessarily drop off. How soon after CREP funds are received can a landowner return the land to cropland?
So typically for a CREP contract, so it is more of a binding contract in that once we do the restoration work and you get paid, you're in a contract for 15 years. If at any point something goes awry or you want to back out of the contract, you are able to do so. However, you have to pay back your rental payments as well as some of the incentive payments that you initially get when you enroll. So short answer there is usually 15 years would be the best way to go about it. The goal of the CREP program was to take ag land out of production to have more natural resource BMPs be installed to allow mainly for water quality is the main aspect of that one. So that's why I think I mentioned briefly in the presentation that for a CP9 shallow water area, you have to have an incoming watershed to it, because they want that water to have an ability to be treated prior to it going further downstream into a more main tributary. And actually with CREP in Maryland, we have additional incentive payments to go into CREP if you're within the Chesapeake Bay tributaries. So you can actually get additional payments from that.
Great. A couple more questions here. What is the natural mortality for female ducks during breeding season?
So that's an excellent question. And that number does exist, although I apologize because I can't pull it out of my head right now. I have to go look it up. But it is an excellent observation, because female ducks in particular are at their most vulnerable when they are nesting. And because of that, they have a higher mortality rate generally than males do. You can imagine if you're required to sit on these eggs for 30 days and not leave, it kind of makes you susceptible to things like raccoons and snakes and et cetera. So I don't know that number off the top of my head. That is when they would experience the highest mortality rate. The number that I do know off the top of my head is that survivability of ducklings is much lower than most people would expect. I mean, there's been a lot of studies on it, and it oftentimes is less than 10%. So if you have 10 ducklings that hatch out, maybe only one will make it to adulthood. So I know that doesn't really answer your question, but it's a fun fact that I do know.
It is a fun fact and leads me down a whole different series of questions that I'd like to ask about that. But I won't get into it because we have time, but that is a very interesting fact. Okay, it looks like we're rounding up on our last question here. Thank you all for sticking around. So did the temperature of the wood duck boxes affect the proportion of males and females going back to your previous study?
Yeah. So the answer to that is no. To my knowledge, it did not affect the gender. However, it did affect some other phenotypes like fitness, essentially like weight. Like ducklings incubated at certain temperatures were more apt to hatch at a higher weight, which therefore affects their survivability, right? They have a higher probability of surviving to adulthood. It affected things like their speed. It's funny, we actually had little ducklings in tanks that made them race each other and test how fast they could swim and to get away from predators and whatnot. So it did have some effects, but not to gender.
Okay. We do have maybe a fun fact here.
Yeah.
Maybe a little scary fun fact that the snakehead fish, the one that's invasive down there in Dorchester County and areas in the lower shore there, that the snakehead fish are predators of the wood duck. Oh my
100%. Yes.
100%, he says.
Yeah.
All
Yeah,
right,
they definitely are. They definitely are. Most fish that are big enough to eat a duckling are a predator of ducklings, but snakeheads, I think, kind of as a new one showing up on the radar, does have the potential to affect wood ducks quite drastically, because not only do they inhabit tidal wetlands, they've been documented as crossing into unconnected freshwater wetlands, and they definitely can impact to wood ducklings. So.
I do want to remind everybody how tasty a snakehead fish is. So if you're looking for a new fish to eat, this is the fish you want to start eating, is the snakehead fish. Okay, they might be a little gross to touch, a little weird to look at, but they taste so good, y'all. So if you want to help out the wood ducks, maybe this is the one way we can do it. Sounds like maybe we need to have a snakehead derby to save the wood ducks. Anyway, okay, you guys, Jake and Chase, I really appreciate your time today. And I thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you for sticking with us. There was a lot of information. I knew these guys would not disappoint. And we thank you all for being open to people getting in touch with you. We really do appreciate that you're there for your community, there for the wood ducks. And let me know if you ever want to partner on a fun project, you guys. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.